the pattern that outlived its purpose. It began as a solution, clear, elegant, and effective, a pattern that solved a real problem at exactly the right moment. And because it worked so well, no one noticed when the moment passed, and the pattern stayed. This matters today because organizations rarely cling to bad ideas. They cling to old solutions that once made everything easier. Patterns don't become dangerous when they fail. They become dangerous when they keep working just enough to avoid scrutiny. The billionaire at the center of this story prized patterns, repeatable actions, reliable sequences. If something worked twice, it was documented. If it worked 3 times, it became standard. Over time, these patterns formed the backbone of the empire's success. The reveal began with confidence. Every major challenge had a familiar response. Growth slowed, apply the pattern. Risk increased, apply the pattern. Competition intensified, apply the pattern. Results stabilized. The system responded exactly as designed. And that consistency felt like mastery. The billionaire trusted the pattern because it had earned trust. It reduced chaos. It simplified decisions. It allowed scale without constant reinvention. Leaders didn't have to debate fundamentals. They executed what was already known to work. But patterns are answers to old questions. The shift happened quietly. The environment changed, but the pattern remained. Problems evolved, but responses stayed the same. The pattern still produced outcomes, just weaker ones. Margins tightened. Timelines stretched. Effort increased for diminishing returns. No alarm sounded, because the pattern had not failed. It had aged. The reveal deepened as teams stopped asking why the pattern existed. It was followed automatically. New hires learned it without context. Leaders enforced it without revisiting its origin. The pattern became process, and process became unquestionable. The billionaire noticed how often conversations ended with, "This is how we do it," not as defense, as explanation. The pattern had outlived its purpose, but not its authority. The first sign of tension appeared when an initiative struggled despite perfect execution. Every step followed the pattern. Every checkpoint passed. And yet, the outcome underwhelmed. The response was not to question the pattern, but to apply it more strictly. That made sense, until it didn't. Because patterns don't expire loudly. They fade into inefficiency. And when leaders mistake familiarity for relevance, the future is forced to fit answers meant for a world that no longer exists. The conflict was beginning to form, not between people, but between a pattern that once solved everything and a present it no longer understood. Because the most dangerous patterns are not wrong. They are outdated and still obeyed. The pattern persisted because it still produced results, just not decisive ones. Performance remained acceptable. Targets were met barely. Each cycle reinforced a belief that refinement, not reconsideration, was needed. The reveal continued as effort increased. Teams worked harder to achieve what once came easily. More steps were added, more reviews inserted. The pattern grew heavier, more complex, as if weight itself could compensate for lost relevance. The billionaire saw this as discipline. Better to execute thoroughly than to abandon what had proven itself. But execution cannot fix misalignment. The conflict sharpened when exceptions multiplied. Situations arose where the pattern didn't quite fit. Adjustments were made locally. Workarounds appeared. The pattern was still referenced, but increasingly bypassed in practice. No one named the contradiction. Officially, the pattern remained law. Unofficially, people adapted around it. The emotional tension surfaced when a new leader asked a simple question: what problem does this pattern still solve? The room went quiet, not defensive, uncertain. The answer was assumed, not articulated. The billionaire felt the weight of that silence. The pattern had become ritual. Rituals persist long after meaning fades. The reveal deepened as alternative approaches succeeded in isolated pockets. Teams that deviated thoughtfully moved faster. Results improved. But these successes were treated as exceptions, not signals. The pattern remained central because it felt safer to maintain than to challenge. The conflict was no longer about effectiveness. It was about legitimacy. The pattern no longer won because it was best. It won because it was familiar. The billionaire recognized a risk clearly. A pattern that outlives its purpose does not protect an organization. It slows it quietly while appearing to help, and the longer remains unquestioned, the more costly it becomes to remove. Not because it works, but because everything else has been built around it. The conflict was approaching a decision point. Either the pattern would be examined honestly, or it would continue shaping outcomes long after it stopped serving them. Because patterns don't stop working suddenly. They stop being worth following. The conflict reached its peak when the pattern finally produced a result no one could explain away. A major initiative followed the sequence perfectly. Every step executed, every safeguard respected, and still failed to deliver meaningful impact. There was no obvious mistake, no broken link, no one to blame. The emotional peak arrived in the review that followed. The pattern was defended instinctively. Maybe execution needed tightening. Maybe commitment wavered. Maybe external factors interfered. Every explanation protected the pattern rather than questioned it, until one leader said what everyone felt. We did everything right. So why did nothing change? That question hung in the room. The billionaire realized the truth immediately. The failure wasn't in execution. It was in relevance. The pattern had solved a different version of the problem, one that no longer existed. The conflict deepened as evidence accumulated. The environment had shifted. Constraints had changed. What once required caution now required speed. What once demanded structure now needed flexibility. The pattern was answering yesterday's risks while today's risks went unaddressed. The realization carried weight. Patterns don't adapt. People do, but only when they're allowed to. The billionaire saw how much energy the organization spent preserving alignment with a process that no longer matched reality. Creativity was spent navigating around the pattern instead of improving outcomes. Innovation existed, but only in the margins. The conflict crystallized into a choice. Continue honoring the pattern out of respect for its past success, or accept that its purpose had expired, even if its legacy had not. Because when patterns become untouchable, they stop being tools. They become obstacles. And unless this one was finally confronted, the empire would keep repeating motions that looked correct, while results drifted further from what the future required. The climax arrived when the billionaire chose to retire the pattern. Not quietly, not gradually, but deliberately. The decision was not framed as correction. It was framed as evolution. The pattern had served its purpose. Now it was standing in the way. The change was unsettling. Processes were stripped back. Mandatory steps removed. Decision paths shortened. Teams were told they no longer needed to justify deviation from pattern, only to justify impact. What mattered was not alignment with history, but relevance to the present. The resolution unfolded through relief. Ideas moved faster. Ownership became clearer. Energy shifted from compliance to intent. Some leaders struggled at first. The pattern had provided certainty. Removing it reintroduced judgment, debate, and risk. But it also reintroduced responsibility. Decisions were no longer inherited. They were owned. The organization began discovering solutions the pattern had filtered out, not because people were smarter, but because they were no longer constrained by answers designed for a different time. The billionaire reflected on the lesson with clarity earned through consequence. Patterns are powerful because they reduce thinking. They become dangerous when they replace it. A pattern that once created speed can later create drag. A solution that once protected can later restrict. The moment leaders stop asking whether a pattern still fits, it begins shaping outcomes silently, long after its value has expired. By letting go, the empire didn't lose discipline. It regained judgment, because progress is not repeating what once worked. It is knowing when to stop. And the hardest patterns to abandon are not the ones that fail, but the ones that succeed just long enough to feel permanent. Subscribe to join the journey. The pattern